In this video, I'm just going to go over a very important point that enterprise architecture isn't optional because it has a strong influence on how we demonstrate the value of our enterprise architecture work. So the hypothesis that I want to put forward here is that enterprise architecture isn't optional. If you had a building, then it must be based on sound architectural principles and practice, because if it isn't, it will fall down. And similarly, if you have an enterprise, then it must have an enterprise architecture. There have got to be some architectural principles, there've got to be architectural components, they've got to be configured in various ways, and you've got to have that. So the question is not, do we need enterprise architecture, but do we want to manage the evolution of our enterprise architecture? And if we want to manage that evolution, if we want to be proactive in how the architecture is structured and how it's used and how it develops, then how well do we need to manage it? So if we take that starting hypothesis that enterprise architecture is not optional, then it means we've got some very clear things that we can look at in terms of costs and benefits from our enterprise architecture work. Here are four possibilities. The first one is that enterprise architecture is not done at all. The second is that we do enterprise architecture but not particularly well. And the third is that we do enterprise architecture and we do it very well. So that gives us two extremes, that we don't do architecture at one end of the spectrum and that we do it and we do it very well at the other end. And for many enterprise architecture teams, they're sitting somewhere in the middle, where they're doing enterprise architecture and they're not doing it as well as they might do, but they're doing as well as they can. Now there is one fourth possibility, and that is that the enterprise architecture, without any intervention from you whatsoever, happens to be a brilliant enterprise architecture. And that does happen particularly in new startup organizations that have got a very, very clear business model. But for many, many enterprises, they have to consider one of the top three options. They have to consider whether they want to do enterprise architecture, and they have to look at how well they need to do it. Now this gives us a very clear chart that we can use to help us look at the outcomes from enterprise architecting, and we can use this chart to look at whether you have some problems and issues that need to be resolved within your enterprise, and also to look at where enterprise architecture can make improvements. Where you have a situation where enterprise architecture is simply not managed at all, there are unnecessary costs, the enterprise architecture is quite random, there's a lot of redundancy and duplication, the architecture is often inefficient, it may well be the wrong architecture, and it may never ever change. So these are all things that you have as constraints or disadvantages when you don't do enterprise architecture. When you do enterprise architecture really well, there are very clear, measurable returns. The evolution of the architecture is something that is proactive and directed. You look at issues holistically. You look at synergies that you can gain by leveraging architecture components across the whole enterprise. The use of the architecture is very collaborative. The way in which the architecture evolves is collaborative. Everyone in the organization is involved working together. When changes happen, when the architecture is changed, it happens on time. It's very timely, it's prioritized, you get the right architecture in the right place at the right time. And in the middle, when enterprise architecture is done but not perfectly, you're going to be somewhere between the two. So you've got rid of some of the costs and you're getting some measurable returns, but the architecture may still be unnecessarily expensive. You're getting rid of some of the randomness and you're starting to move towards a directed evolution of the architecture, but some of the changes are still going to be long-winded and tedious. You're getting away from the redundancy and the duplication. You're starting to get more synergistic and holistic, but there might still be poor alignment between some parts of the enterprise and other parts, and you're still going to have partisan interests. The architecture is starting to move away from being inefficient. It's starting to be more collaborative, but it might still not be as effective as it could be. You're moving away from the wrong architecture to exactly the right architecture you need, but it's still slightly off beam in places. The architecture is changing, but the changes are not necessarily the right ones in the right place at the right time. You might have the right idea, but the timing might be wrong. You might not be able to deliver the things that are needed as they are needed.